Now, the second speaker in this session is the Dr. Sarah Paine, the U.S. Naval College Professor of Emeritus. Her specialty is Eastern Asia International Relations and Sino-Japan War. She is also the book of the Sino-Japanese War of 1994 to 1895, Possession, Power, and Primacy, The Wars for Asia, 1911 to 1949. And this book is the Japanese translation titled as in Japanese of the Asian Multilateral War in 1911 to 1949. And also, she has the book, The Japanese Empire Grand Strategy from the Meiji Restoration to the Pacific War. Today, she'll be presenting the title as the Sino-Japanese War as a part of the global history. So Dr. Paine, please.
It's an honor being here. And the fighting between Japan and China in the 1930s is really unusual. It's a really big war, and people can't agree on what to call it and what year it began in. So here's my game plan. I'm going to talk about first the dating, then the naming, then the goals of all the parties going in, the consequences coming out, and how on earth they got it there, the strategy. So that's my plan, and here we go. Many date the beginning of the war with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, right? It was a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge that within the end of the year you have armies all over China. So that's one way of looking at it. Others say, you know, there are actually other really major military operations going on in the internationally recognized territory of China, which would be Manchuria, minor railway incident that leads to the occupation of all of Manchuria. And then it turned out that occupying Manchuria was one thing, that was fast, but pacifying it was another thing. That was difficult. You look at the statistics here, Japan's dealing with first hundreds of thousands of insurgents, and then by 37, still tens of thousands. And if you look at the size of the Kanto Gun, starting around 10,000 people, and then it's going to be up to hundreds of thousands. So it seems like there are difficulties going on here. And then if you look at the size of territory involved, I believe what Manchukuo became was about 3 times the size of Japan, population about half of Japan's. But then if you look at the population there, it's 85% Chinese, but the name's Manchukuo, right? It's supposed to be Manchurian. Manchu, so something's going on there. And in addition, the fighting didn't stop with Manchuria. It continues by, you're getting to into Jehol, which is the seat of former Manchu imperial rule in China. Jehol is, I think, half the size of Honshu. That's occupied in 1933. You get an expanded Manchukuo out of that, but it doesn't stop. There are military operations into Inner Mongolia and Chahar campaign, and it'll be in Suiyuan, and also going into Hebei, and then there's a Tanggu peace. But it continues all the way through 1935, 1936, when you're having cabinet discussions here in Tokyo discussing about detaching these 5 northern provinces of China and turning them into, I don't know, a Mongol homeland or something. So these are continuous military operations. So I believe, in my simplistic way of looking at things, if you're talking about big military operations, they're starting in 31, they're continuous, they escalate massively in 1937. All the people resisting these operations are citizens on the internationally recognized territory of China. And I think there's agreement on when it ends, 45, right? This is when there are 2 atomic bombs on the home islands, and 1.5 million Soviet soldiers pouring into Manchuria. If it continues, they're going to come to the home islands. And then, of course, the U.S. is in occupation from 45 to 52. So people agree on the ending. So I make my case, 31 to 45 for the dates. All right. Now for the naming of this. There are many in Japan who have favored calling the 1931 beginning incidents as the Manchurian incident, the 1937 escalation, the Marco Polo Bridge incident. But when that thing went across all of China, the bridge didn't seem sufficient, so it becomes known as the China incident. And for those favoring this terminology, it's as if incidents just happen to people instead of that we human beings make the decision of whether or not we're going to kill each other. So That's one way of looking at it. And then there's a big escalation that goes on, and then it becomes the Pacific War. And it's interesting, there is no formal declarations of war, and part of that has to, unlike the first Sino-Japanese War, because it would have triggered the Neutrality Acts in the United States that would have cut off war material to both China and Japan. But even in the first Sino-Japanese War, there's different terminology in Japan and in China for what to call it. So I think that the Sino-Japanese terminology, a lot of it comes from the West, because Westerners are going, okay, they're Chinese, they're Japanese, they're fighting, and there are two of these events. So there's the first one and the second one. I think that's where that comes from. All right, in my understanding in Japan, for those favoring the use of incidents, when the fighting extends to the United States and the Allies, then the initial name is the Greater War of East Asia, and then post-war, hasn't it become the Asia-Pacific War, the Pacific Ocean War, and people favoring this way of looking at things are treating that there's a China theater and then there's a Pacific theater, and people tend to specialize in one or the other and not pay too much attention to the other, except they were fought simultaneously, and militaries across the world had to decide where they're going to put their resources and their trade-offs between these theaters, and you don't get the one without the other. So they're interconnected from the beginning. Now, when the Chinese look at this, both Taiwanese and people on the mainland, they don't much care about the Pacific War. They focus on their war, on the China theater, and they call it the war to resist Japan. Okay, that makes it clear the Chinese resisted, but who won the thing? That's where leaving out the American piece of this, and British, et cetera, is a rather large omission. There's some other omissions that the PRC, People's Republic of China, makes, which is they missed the part that it was the nationalists who fought all the conventional battles against Japan. It was not the Chinese communists. The only conventional battle the Chinese communists fought was this thing here, the 100 Regiments campaign. In 1940, they lost. Japan decimated them and removed Chinese forces from communist forces from much of North China. And Mao Zedong, who must have helped plan this thing, doesn't mention it anywhere in his collective works, and they never try it again. So it's the nationalists fighting this thing. Also, the communists do not acknowledge that not only they had guerrilla forces behind Japanese lines, so did the nationalists. So there's more going on than they're giving credit to. So we have the Chinese focusing on the China theater, or Americans focus only on the Pacific theater. And they're missing it, which is that the Chinese fought the Japanese to a stalemate in 1938. And that's when Japan reaches the end of China's very limited railway system on which its way of war depends. And China is just too big a place to garrison. So Americans aren't paying attention to that. And Americans are also missing this one, which is the Chinese are tying down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops, massive resources to tell this story, America, ta-da, defeats Japan, much more complicated than Americans have been willing to admit. If you look at what's really going on, you have a regional war in Europe, the first regional war is in Asia in 31, the regional war in Europe breaks out in 39, and they merge in Asia when the Germans and Italians declare war on the United States in solidarity with their ally, Japan. So it's this tragic escalation. Okay, I think I got dating and naming, and now for goals of what everyone thought they were trying to achieve in all this. And it's hard to understand with human motivations. They're complex. So these are my guesses what's going on. Is in response to Western protectionism, Japan was in real trouble. Where are you going to get your markets? And so one solution to that one is empire and autarky, which is where Manchuria comes in. So Japan wants to keep Manchuria. The Chinese want Japan to give up Manchuria, and they resist. And then pretty soon the Japanese they want to change the government of China. And so we've got escalating goals. If you look at the goals of the nationalist government of China, this is the internationally recognized government under Chiang Kai-shek, it's to win the civil war against the communists. And they came really, really close. Chiang Kai-shek, by 1934, this is when you have the Long March, it's really the long route is when the communists are fleeing up north close to the Soviet border. They're losing 90% of their cadres. However, Chiang Kai-shek's own population is unwilling to let him to focus on defeating communists while Japan is moving ever further southward. And so Chiang Kai-shek thought he wanted to finish off communists before he dealt with Japanese because he knew he would become overextended. But he was he couldn't do that. So that's how that one starts out. And then if you look at what the Soviet Union wants to spread communism globally. And so it doesn't go so well in Europe, so they move to focus on Asia, and then they're busy funding the Chinese Communist Party, getting that going. And by the time you get to the early 30s, the Soviets are terrified that they're going to have Germans coming at them from the west and Japanese coming at them from the east, because Hitler has this Lebensraum idea, living space area, and then the Imperial Japanese Army has its Northern Advance strategy to take Siberia, and the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 makes the Soviet Union thinking, they've merged the plan to come get us. Within 2 weeks of that pact, Stalin is playing every single one of his China cards. He's been funding multiple sides in the Civil War to get the nationalists and communists to stop fighting each other and to unite against Japan instead. And this is brokered in the Xi'an incident at the end of 1936. And then this helps explain why the Marco Polo Bridge incident isn't just another minor military altercation, because the communists and the nationalists had re-allied to fight Japan. The Japanese react viscerally at the Marco Polo Bridge. Okay. The Europeans and the United States, well, actually, the Europeans wanted to keep their concession areas, right? Whereas the nationalists wanted all concession areas out of China. And the Americans didn't have concession areas, but were just not paying attention too hard about what was going on, had a lot of big ideas, but wasn't willing to do anything much about it. But then, with the gathering war in Europe, the United States wants to stockpile war material for fighting that war. And although it also doesn't like Japan's military operations in China, nor do the Europeans, but the embargo would also allow, of goods to Japan would also allow the United States to stockpile against Germany while all of this is going on. And so Americans are going into deep protectionism, raising tariff walls, and not thinking about the implications of doing all of this. And then, of course, war comes to you anyway when other people are in desperate situation, right, with these tariff walls. Then they take desperate decisions, and that was Japan's desperate decision when it went after Pearl Harbor and other places. Okay, so those are the basic goals. Europeans wanted Japan to leave China, but that's not going to happen. Now over the consequences of all of this. Well, you know about the ones in Japan. I don't think any country has ever suffered the kind of devastation Japan did. 2 atomic bombs, cities burned to the ground. If you think about the other consequences, so Japanese generals and admirals embarked on this military strategy where they wanted to save their homeland, and this is the result. Their homeland's destroyed. And so it's about thinking deeply about these things. And Japan's neighbors have never forgotten or forgiven this, right? Think about it. These decisions made 4 generations are still hamstringing Japanese foreign policy. It's an incredible burden for one generation to burden following generations. So it makes this conference really important to think about these things. If you're thinking about the Chinese, the outcome for China, prior to 1937, the communists are losing the Civil War, right? I told you about the Long March where they've lost everybody. And the communists are going to use this big escalation to turn the tide in the Civil War. Because Japan is focusing its military operations on nationalist armies, right? I've talked about how they're the only ones doing the fighting again, or the major fighting against Japan, and Japan is going to be eliminating nationalist formations. And it gets worse because while the communists are offering the peasants land reform and they're trying to set up the post-World War Civil War, the nationalists are dragooning peasants into their armies. So there's going to be a rapid reassessment that once Japan is defeated, Chiang Kai-shek's going to find that people are defecting from his armies in droves, joining the communists and making their victory a certainty. If you look at Stalin, he got Japan to, or the communists rather, to fight Japan so that there is no two-front war. And think about Russia. Russia had lost a one-front war to Germany in World War I when it had great power allies. So the Chinese saved Stalin from this outcome. But at the end of the war, he got much more China than he wanted. In fact, when Mao was doing really well in the Chinese Civil War, he's going rapidly down from Manchuria, and Mao was saying, hey, why don't you stop and take a rest at the Yangtze River? And he's looking for a divided China, the way he had a divided Germany, and he's going to get a divided Korea. And Mao is not interested in two Chinas. He keeps on going, reunites the place. And for until the 1960 Sino-Soviet split, it looks as if there's this really scary Sino-Soviet monolith sending chills down Western spines. If you look at the consequences for the United States, a unified, communist, viscerally anti-Western China is a really bad outcome. And it makes it much more difficult in the ensuing Korean and Vietnam wars than if those two countries, Korea and Vietnam, had bordered on nationalist rather than communist China. So incredible implications. And then if you think about this, what are Japan's and U.S. objectives prior to the Great Depression vis-a-vis China? Well, it's to have a stable China, right? So you can invest there so that there will be international trade. And coming out, we're ruining each other. So we share these objectives in common, and fighting each other, you would think, would not be the best way to approach all of this. Okay. So we got a rather bad outcome here for most of the players. How on earth did this happen? One of the issues has to do with drawing military lessons from past success. And Japanese military officers, I believe, and people in the room feel free to correct me, that Japanese military officers misconstrued the origins of their tremendous military success in the First Sino-Japanese War of defeating China, this huge country, and then in the Russo-Japanese War defeating Russia, another huge country. And I believe the lesson they derived, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that military coercion will deliver power in this world. It'll make you prosperous. And I think what they're missing is the really astute diplomacy that went into making sure there was no third-party intervention in either of these wars, and also the very astute financing of the wars, and also a basic understanding that wealth and power in the position in this world actually come from industrialization, stable political institutions, law, how you're managing your economic policy, and that military adventures, even absolutely necessary ones, they cost money, they don't generate money, and it's missing all of this. And so it becomes even worse when you have officers in the 20s and 30s who are not respecting the contributions of other professions. They see their own contributions, but they don't see the diplomats who avoided the third-party intervention, and the financial experts, and also that they gave generous peace terms so that the defeated are willing to quit, right? If you just keep upping your peace terms, they won't quit. And so it gets worse in that those who provided the most compelling counter-arguments for these military plans, quite often they were assassinated, particularly here, who comes to mind is Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo, who had returned the Japanese economy to prosperity, or at least economic growth, after the Great Depression, long before Europe did. And so, anyway, the strategies that went on in China were Japanese military strategies, were attacking a series of centers of gravity, which the idea being if you defeat it, you'll win the war. So the Japanese destroyed Jiang's armies repeatedly, take its economy, take its capital cities that keep moving up the Yangtze River, attack the Chinese will to fight, which explains the civilian casualties at Nanjing, Suzhou, the burning of Zhejiang, and the relentless bombing of Chongqing. And then there's on attacking the nationalist leadership. You set up a government under Wang Jingwei. And then the last idea is, well, okay, we're going to cut foreign aid, and somehow that will work. The problem is the value of the object for the Chinese was survival in their homeland. And so it meant that all of this pressure, instead of shattering the Chinese, it galvanized them to put aside their differences with each other to fight Japan. And you can see this process today in Ukraine. And in the case of the United States, attacking Pearl Harbor and everywhere else, of course, takes this isolationist country to make it the most interventionist country around. So it's a horrible outcome from Japan's point of view. Okay, U.S. strategy has to do with leveraging its production, its ability to read encrypted Japanese communications, and then just taking enough military positions so that you can do the incendiary bombing on Japan. In all sides, it became a war without mercy, something never to be repeated. For the China and Jiang's strategy had to do with ceding space to the Japanese in order to buy time against the communists, but he wasn't given that time. And then once Japan was in, he thought he needed a foreign friend to help him out, thought it would be Russia, but then the Nazis are busy in Russia, so then he thinks it's the United States. And he thinks time's on China's, not Japan's side, correct, but in China, the time is on Mao's side, not on his side, as Japan ruins his armies. And in fact, Mao, as you all must know better than I do, when Prime Minister Tanaka was in Beijing in 1972, Mao was congratulating him for helping him win the Chinese Civil War, the worst possible outcome for Japan. Okay, for the United States and others, we're still dealing with this China problem. And for those who survived the conflagration, they've drawn any number of lessons from it. But here are the ones I will give to you. The one I think is among the most important for militaries and governments is you've got to disaggregate the strategic from your operational goals. That strategic goals are things like protecting my national security, enhancing prosperity, and your operational strategies have got to align with this, and they usually involve integrating multiple instruments of national power, not simply coercion, right? Because if all you're doing is coercing people, they probably are going to resist. And so, let me make sure I do this properly. If you think about the United States and Japan, we had a shared goal about what China should be, which is a stable country integrated into the international system. But you get Western protectionism, right, that makes people desperate the world around, and Japan thinks it needs an empire to deal with that. And when you deepen desperation globally, you have troubles. And then if you think about these wars I've discussed today, they take away the main bulwarks against communist expansion, right? What are they? The nationalists in China and Japan regionally. Well, they're removed. So what do you think is going to happen? You're going to have communists moving into the vacuum. So we are still dealing with this unified, anti-Western, anti-Japanese, communist, unified China. So it is really important to disaggregate operational from strategic. And think about the Pearl Harbor attack. It is brilliant military operation. It is executed perfectly, but it leads to the destruction of Japan. That's a strategic problem. It means the strategy is no good if that's what it's going to do to you. Today, Americans are having trouble understanding the connections of strategic consequences of their operations and the things they're doing. And you can watch the America Firsters return with the tariffs. And now we live in an age of precision nuclear strike. And it's not going to go well unless we preserve this rules-based order to protect the security of us all. Thank you very much for your time.
Professor Paine, thank you very much. And we would like to have some panel discussion. First of all, we would like to NIDS advisor, Dr. SHOJI, Senior Research Advisor, NIDS. And he has a series of books on the subject matters. And as for the discussant, we would like to have presentators' question and answer session. Please be brief in answering the questions raised. Dr. SHOJI, please. Yes, thank you for the introductions. As for the first session, we had a report on the Sino-Japanese War and the Pacific War, or the Great Eastern Asia War, and featuring the global history. That is the main theme. As for Dr. Takeda's report, he had Far East Asia, or the Greater East Asia Conference and the declarations, and discuss the similarity of the concept of orders in East Asia and the differences and the characteristics. And unlike the past perception of having an Asian principle, this region had the Western type international order concept. And as for the Great East Asia Declaration, it was discussed from the Asia's perspective of liberations and its denials and the deceptions and so on. But in this report, the universal view as well as the post-war vision were discussed in terms of modern nature of the perception of the order in the region. As for the modern nature of the Great East Asian Declaration, as long as the abolishment of the racism, in addition to that, the open up of natural resources have been widely discussed. As for the resource liberation, has been the issue since League of Nations in 1930s, and through the United Nations Charter, it materialized finally as WTO. It was slightly touched upon in the Atlantic Order, but was resisted by the British to a certain extent. And Anglo-American Alliance was called Allies of a Kind, focusing on Europe. Number 3, the Greater East Asia Declaration has been criticized for a long time as a deception, showing the lack of strategies in Japan, as well as a justification as an afterthought. And of course, some aspect of that criticism is true, but these declarations featured idealistic contents. And also, I would like to point out the difference of the Great East Asia Sphere concept and the difference of the idealism in the German-Russian War. And number 4, the Great East Asia Declaration focused on the diversity of the region as well as the complexity. And the Asia or the Far East was based upon the China-based view of world order. And also Southeast Asia had a colony-based order and perceptions as well. Now I come to the question. Dr. Takeda positioned this Great East Asia Declaration as a political war. In what context? Is that Asian-based ones? And was it also incorporating post-war visions? And what about the resilience of modern society nature in Asia, especially the China's perspective of international order? And does it have potential to be integrated into the global one in terms of perception of the modernity? And the Pacific War, what will be the impact on the post-war East Asia order building? This is a question to Dr. Paine. The Sino-Japanese War has been discussed in a global perspective in a comprehensive way. As for the pre-war Japan's failure, strategy and tactics considered, the success was to set the strategic aims, and the military force in application leading to the expansion of the territory may deteriorate national stamina and could be counterproductive. And as for post-war Japan, not only the Japan-China war and the past that we have to revisit has been discussed widely because of its diverse definition of the nature as well as the period. And as for Dr. Paine pointed out, the post-Manchurian incident being called the 15-year war, as well as China's 14 years of resistance war, has been the continuum, not cannot be sectioned, and has been consistent in terms of reviewing the history. In case of Japan, the decision-making was reactive to the war situations, resulting in irrational leadership during the war. And number 3, the European War and the Asian War were different in terms of nature. The European War started as an autonomous, conflict, but the Asian wars were affected by the war situations in Europe and cannot be simply put to the war of fascism versus democracy type of nature, so to speak. Of course, fascism versus democracy element existed in the wars of Asia, but the Asian wars were not featured in terms of a strong racism rather, Japan was hesitant to, let's say, strengthen or reiterate racism in that. Here are the questions. U.S.-Japan war could have been avoided, perhaps. As you have mentioned, Soviet and Germany are the most important, say, adversaries to U.S. and not Japan. But ironically, Japan and U.S. were engaged in wars, and that resulted in the rise of China and Soviets, and expanded into later post-war Vietnam Wars and so on. And China and Russia become big powers. And what about the foreign affairs paper of yours, the superiority of the maritime state over continental state because of the wealth and attrition problems? Japan has been perceived as vulnerable and without strategies, and why the Japan pursued the continental as well as the maritime states way of survival, so to speak. And Japan was considered to be the country of have-not, and the situation was different from U.S. and UK. What was the essence of Pacific War itself? Is this about sovereignty amongst Japan, US, and Soviet? Or was this US versus Japan and Japan versus China, or Asia versus Europe, or Japan, US versus Europe for decolonization? Dr. Shoji, thank you very much. Dr. Takeda, please. Dr. Shoji, thank you for your questions. I would like to try to answer your questions at my best, but my time is limited. Your questions are quite sharp. I appreciate that, and I thought hard about them. And as much as I can offer as an answer, the Great East Asia Declaration, it was part of the political warfares that I conceived as my historical view 10 years ago. And at that time, Shigemitsu Mamoru, as I featured in my presentation, when being engaged in the war against U.S., it's unimaginable, he thought, at the beginning, especially in 1930s. In that context, this declaration said we are equal-footed in terms of objectives in the pursuit of international order. That was a message behind. And also, the post-war Japan, New Start, he was trying to lay the ground or the foundation to start with. So it was addressed to Western powers as well as the post-war Japan retrospectively. And what about its influence or impact to the post-war Japan? We were defeated 45 August 15th, and we were left with so little and not much assets to rely on for post-war build-up. So negative asset was quite great. But despite of that, ASEAN relationship as well as U.S. relationship were beginning to emerge. And I skipped so many details in my presentation, but these ideas for pro-Asia and pro-US relationship existed in the pre-war times. And we would like to study from its origins. Thank you.
それではペイン先生。
Now, Dr.
簡潔
Paine,
に
please
お願いいたします
be brief.
I don't think I understood all of the questions that you were asking me. So forgive me when I don't answer things. But I think the important thing for me to transmit is another way of looking at these wars is between two fundamentally different security paradigms. One is continental and the one is maritime. And Japan, by geography, has to follow a maritime security paradigm because you're islands. And Britain the same way. And it has to do, I'm now going to put a period there, and now I'm going to talk about the continentalists. The continentalists are all about territory. They want to expand territory. They tend to privilege their armies because that's how they're going to get their territories. They tend to organize their economies around what their armies require. So that's what they're doing. It goes way back in history. It's probably the original security paradigm of human beings. So this you'd know much more about. But when you're having the different daimyo fighting in Japan within Japan, it's probably a continental thing, and that I don't know, and I'm asking for trouble even bringing it up. But so when you're thinking about Russia and China today, they're continentalists. They're about territory. They think territory is going to make them great. Whereas once the Industrial Revolution hit and you have compounded economic growth, it's all of this wealth from, as you all know of more than anybody else in Japan, compounded growth from industrialization, trade, commerce, the works. That's what makes you wealthy. And then from that, you can fund an army and do some other things with it. And all of this trade that we connect with each other, it's maritime. That's why I'm going to say it's a maritime paradigm. That most of world trade, it goes by sea, and the communications goes by undersea cables and things. So this war that we've been discussing today is about the continentalists trying to impose a continental world order divided into spheres of interest. I think Japan made a pivotal mistake when it responded to the Depression by choosing a continental security paradigm, where you're going to go try to take a lot of territory, and that's problematic from Japan because you're cut it off by sea, you're dependent on energy and food, so that if people, and also many other resources, so if people cut you off by sea, you're in trouble. So but in the Depression, there weren't good strategies available. In our own day, you can see this going on with China and Russia currently in Ukraine. It is a negative-sum world order. If you are fighting with each other, look, we've just looked at this war. Think of all the wealth and lives that were destroyed. It's unbelievable. It's not wealth-producing to solve your problems in this way. And the problem is right now, given that the World War II generation is all dead, the ones who remember it as anything but a teeny tiny child, they're all gone. And the wisdom acquired from that is all gone. And we are, what to me it looks like as a historian studying things, and historians understand continuities. They don't understand discontinuities. So beware of what I'm telling you. It's what I think to be the case, I could be wrong, is we're barreling our way towards a world war if we're not careful. And the only win-win is this rules-based maritime system where we send our diplomats and international lawyers. And if we're going to solve it by the United States taking the Panama Canal, invading Canada, taking Greenland, it's all over if this is what happens. So if you're wondering why I'm being so frank, I think it's important. I regard this as my responsibility of my generation. I spent a lifetime studying these things. It doesn't mean I'm right, but it's to bring up these issues, and I'm very happy to hear the counter-argument. Please tell me where I'm wrong. I have no problems about that, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Paine. Panelists, Thank you very much for your active discussion. This concludes session 1.